Hello, I got an email asking me to do a request on this, but realistically it was one that was on the to-do list anyway, and was certainly an interesting piece to discuss. For those who are interested, send me an email, boxinggossip@googlemail.com. I try and do all the requests I'm getting and post a video discussing any topic boxing related of choice. Could consider talking about non-boxing related topics, but I'm not sure how strong my knowledge would be. But yeah, either comment on one of the videos or send me an email if you're interested in hearing. I've got a few videos coming either later today or tomorrow, Thursday, doing some fight previews for the weekend. Provodnikov, Matisse, the Chavez fight, also the Crawford fight, so expect those to come out shortly. Now to the matter in hand. Andy Lee retains his WBO middleweight title. He drew with Peter Quillen, as we know, and his next fight, there's been a lot of talk saying there should be a rematch for Andy Lee, Peter Quillen. As I understand it, his next fight is going to be Billy Joe Saunders. Billy Joe was the mandatory. He took a step-aside deal to let Andy Lee fight Peter Quillen, and Billy Joe is now intending to enforce his mandatory position, and it's been agreed the two will fight next. There is a slight caveat to that deal. It may be the case that Billy Joe can get more money rematching Chris Eubank Jr. If he is offered step-aside money again by Team Lee or Team Quillen, I think there's scope for him to take it. I mean, from Billy Joe Saunders' perspective, he's already beaten Chris Eubank Jr. He feels he can do a better job on him next time. It's probably going to be more money. So if he gets that fight, which he views as an easier fight, and he gets a bigger payday for it, and he maybe gets another injection of step-aside money, it is possible that Billy Joe will take that fight, and this fight won't go ahead. So there's a slight caveat there, in that I acknowledge Billy Joe has now been mandatory for both the WBO, IBF titles and hasn't fought on either occasion. And my inclination is there is a small risk that will happen again, because I think Billy Joe and Chris Eubank Jr. are just so synonymous with each other. But let's put that to the side for now. Let's presume the fight goes ahead, and let's talk how I see it going. There's a lot to like about Andy Lee. I'm critical of Andy Lee online, but as I always say, I've been a fan of him for a very, very long time, way before he was a world champion. He's got heart, he's got durability, he's got a good story, and he's got game-changing power. He's the proverbial underdog, and there really is a lot to like about him. He's a likeable fella outside the ring. Inside the ring, at times, although he wasn't against Quillen, but at times he can be an attractive boxer to watch, and he always brings that excitement factor with the punching power he brings to the ring. The difficulty with Andy Lee, put simply, is whilst he has the capability to grit it out, to get there in the end, he isn't the greatest boxer. And by boxer, I don't mean competitor of the sport, I mean technical boxer. He can be outboxed. Let's put it this way. If you take the first half of the Quillen fight, the first 5 rounds of the Korobov fight, the first 5 rounds of the John Jackson fight, it's very hard to give Andy Lee any more than 1, 2 rounds across those 16 rounds of boxing. My point is, he's a guy who is fit. He's a guy who carries power late on into fights. He's a guy who comes on strongly when opponents weaken. He's a guy who's still punching hard when opponents' defence are starting to drop, when opponents' stamina is starting to lapse. But at the start of the fight, he's very, very vulnerable. I thought Peter Quillen dominated the first half of the fight. There was a 10-8 round 1, a 10-8 round 3, and I pretty much scored everything to Quillen in the first half of the fight. I think it's very, very difficult to make a case that Lee won a single round. Now, arguably that's okay against Peter Quillen, who is widely regarded the number 2 middleweight in the division. But it's less okay against John Jackson, a light middleweight, and Matt Korobov, a guy who is kind of hard to really consider a top 20 middleweight. My point is, a really sophisticated amateur can outbox Lee. The way I see it, Lee is vulnerable in several different areas. He likes to counterpunch, and as a result, he likes to fight long and counterpunch. We saw that against Quillen, for example. And as a result, I suspect he is vulnerable to a volume fighter. A fighter who, unlike Quillen, can take advantage by having a large increased punch output. And unlike Quillen, someone who throws punches in bunches, someone who sows their activity through active combinations. I don't think Andy Lee is the most advanced mover. And I think Andy Lee doesn't use his jab regularly enough. I thought his jab was quite effective against Peter Quillen, but it was only effective on the rare occasion he used it. My point is, in Billy Joe Saunders, who I am a massive fan of, but who I would acknowledge is far from a complete fighter at this stage. But in Billy Joe Saunders, you have a guy with serious amateur pedigree. You have a guy who starts quickly, throws combinations from the first round. Look at how he started against Chris Eubank Jr., for example. You have a guy who can jab his way in. My point is, Billy Joe ticks a lot of the boxes in terms of the steps, the things you would look for in terms of a fighter who'll beat Andy Lee. Billy Joe's got that amateur background, he's got that technical capability, the jab, the movement, the volume, the punching output, the combination work. He's got all of that in droves. Now, Billy Joe is a fighter previously whose stamina has looked better in the first half of a fight than the second half of the fight. Speaking frankly, just enjoying a gin and tonic. Classy, I know. Speaking frankly, he was far less effective against John Ryder and against Chris Eubank Jr. in the second half of their respective fights than in the first half. Arguably, that makes him vulnerable to a guy like Andy Lee, who we know is still there. But I think what Billy Joe Saunders has shown is huge heart, huge grit, and huge determination in his fights, equal to that which Andy Lee has shown. Peter Quillen, he knew that he was well ahead. He knew the fight was getting close. But he didn't, in my eyes, show the closing ability. He didn't, increase his work rate. He didn't take any risks. Billy Joe has proven against Eubank, against John Ryder, that he won't fall into the same trap. If it needs to go into a dogfight, Billy Joe will do that. And Billy Joe Saunders has an excellent chin. I don't believe he's ever been dropped in his pro career. Now, granted, the punches he's been in with possibly don't hit as hard as Andy Lee, but Billy Joe has a knack of getting through those tough rounds, and because he doesn't carry immense punching power himself, he is very familiar with going the 12-round distance. He's had a very hard road to the top, Billy Joe. How many undefeated fighters has he beaten? John Ryder, Spike O'Sullivan, Chris Eubank Jr., Emmanuel Blandamura, other fighters, Nick Blackwell, for example. Billy Joe is a guy who's familiar with going the distance. He hasn't had the best conditioning in fights previously, and as a result, we've seen him develop experience and tactics of getting through the difficult rounds when stamina's being sapped. He's familiar, and he's always got the jobs done. He knows that challenge. He's got defence, he's got a superb chin, and he can get down and fight when he needs to. He's not just an Erislandy Lara style jabber and mover. He's got a bit of dog in him, which I really like and respect when I'm analysing a fighter. My point is, I see Billy Joe Saunders schooling Andy Lee. the first half of the fight. Now, I don't think that's a controversial statement if you consider that Korobov, John Jackson and Peter Quillen all destroyed Andy Lee in the first few rounds of their fights. I think, unlike Peter Quillen, Billy Joe doesn't have the power to be flooring Andy Lee. But after the first 7 rounds of the fight, I find it hard to believe that the scorecard is not going to be something like 5-2, 6-1, potentially even 7-0 to Billy Joe Saunders. I just do not think Andy Lee is going to be dealing with the movement. I do not think Andy Lee is going to be dealing with the combinations, with the jab of Billy Joe early on. I think Billy Joe's going to box rings around him, I really do. And I think if Billy Joe's stamina does start to drop, bearing in mind he's a high volume, high work rate combination puncher in the early rounds. Seeing as he's a fast starter, I expect Billy Joe to do his best work early on, just like he did against Ryder, just like he did against Eubank. But if Billy Joe does get tired, it's going to be different to how Andy Lee came back against Peter Quillen. Because Billy Joe is mobile. He's not like Peter Quillen, who was a stationary fighter. He's mobile. He fights on the back foot. He's got a defensive jab. You know, Quillen's got a lot of attributes that Billy Joe doesn't have. But when Quillen was drained in that fight, when he was struggling towards the end, it was telling how little he was moving, how little he was jabbing. And Billy Joe, I don't think, will accept a fight slipping away from him in the same way Quillen did. Billy Joe's shown that heart and desire against fighters like Chris Eubank, against fighters like John Ryder, who are both guys who I would give a chance of beating Andy Lee based on Andy Lee's recent performances. I really think Billy Joe takes the fight. I think it goes points. I see it something like 116, 112 Billy Joe. I think Billy dominates the first half of the fight. I think Andy Lee starts to come back into it, but I think Billy is too mobile and too defensively aware to get knocked out. And I also think he's got heart and chin and durability. And I think it may not be pretty in rounds 10, 11 and 12, but he's done it before, he'll do it again. And I think Billy Joe takes the belt from Andy Lee. You never rule Andy Lee out. But for me, Andy Lee, in a fight against Billy Joe, I can't see him winning on points. I only see Andy Lee winning by knockout. And I think Billy Joe Saunders is an incredibly difficult person to knock out. Let me know your thoughts. I'm keen to discuss. Many thanks for watching.